Dr. Nicola Ambrosio was one of my professors I had the pleasure of learning under in my undergraduate program, and she taught me a class on fairy tales, but she also she works at MSU now, and she teaches courses on, in addition to fairy tales and mythology, she teaches on the plague and of course witchcraft and women, and she's an English professor, so she also has a background in theater, and I'm very excited to be able to introduce her and have her with us today.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I also want to just really quickly say, for folks who are interested in Lucian's talk, and if they can't make it or they want to do some pre-work, I highly recommend the documentary Hail Satan. If you have any conceptions of what Satanism is, that film and documentary will completely disabuse you of those notions. Lucian's work is really important, and I hope to attend that because he's fantastic and a great speaker and very inspirational. So thank you so much for coming here today. As Victoria said, I'm Nicola Ambrosio, and I'm going to share my screen, if I may. And okay, I think I'm sharing. It's sharing. Yes, okay. And I'm also actually gonna turn off my camera while I share. I'm gonna try really hard to stay in my time frame, but this is a lot to cover in such a small amount of time. So I'm here to talk today, and really excited to talk today, in fact, about women in witchcraft, which is a topic of both professional and personal interest. And today I'm gonna talk mainly about the figure of the witch through history and society. And oops, sorry. And I start with this quote that I often give, and it's me. I say this, but I put it in quotes because it's kind of the framework for my entire talk today and a lot of the work I do. And even when I start this class, when I'm teaching it, I always start with the history of witches is the history of women. And this is actually kind of a radical statement, because only for the past 10 to 15 years or so has the history of the witch been interpreted as also a history of what women were doing or perceived as being. Prior to then, historians really saw witch hunts and witch craves and the history of witches as a result of religious upheaval or growth of new nations or isolations of peasants or poisoned crops. But really when we look at it as the evolution of the depiction of witches, we take on a different perspective emerges when we look at the women who were actually involved in witch trials and witch hunts. So I'm going to get started though with a little activity. I asked you to grab some paper and some pencils, and I'm going to try to take 3 minutes or less, so it doesn't have to be perfect. But when you hear the word witch, what do you think of? Use that paper, markers, pencils, whatever you have to draw your image. And while you do that, please enjoy another sweet song.
Keep that tender heart. All the pain you take and make the start. In this life you learn your strength and strive. You're more than just a mistress. Oh, why? When it's not safe to walk these streets, join your hands and sing with me. Raise our voices, hear our plea. We are the dawn.
just another 30 seconds or so.
In a world that's run on pride and force, women of the world.
All right. If you wouldn't mind, take just a minute to put on your camera and show us what you drew, if you don't mind. I just love to see what people have here. Oh my gosh, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and just look at these. This is fantastic. Lynn and George did a fantastic job. This is great. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Great. Fantastic. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. I think if you got a chance to look at those screens and what people drew, you might see some commonalities. In fact, often when we think of witches, we think of them as being female. Now, not all of these can, not all of your images had this, but many of them did. They often are considered to be female. They often are menacing or goofy or cute, right? They can be one of those things. You mainly had pencils, but so often when I do this activity, people color them in with some kind of green skin. They have large noses. There's usually a wart or a mole involved. They can be old or they can be sexy. They often have pointy hats. They often wear black clothing. They often have common objects with them, like brooms, cauldrons, cats, sometimes owls. They're often depicted flying through the air on those brooms, and they're often associated with the moon. Now, I'm going to offer you a definition of the witch that comes from Merriam-Webster. It says there that the witch is one that is credited with usually malignant supernatural powers, especially especially a woman practicing usually black witchcraft, often with the aid of a devil or familiar. Today, I'm really going to focus on this, especially a woman. I want us to consider how that came to pass. After all, there have always been male and gender nonconforming practitioners of magic who have been called or who call themselves witches. In fact, Gerald Gardner, the founder of the religion that came to be called Wicca, was a man. Yet, the vast majority of people persecuted in the name of witchcraft have been female. So I'm going to start with I'm going to start with a very brief, I'm going to try to make it brief, historical overview of the witch in history and how the figure has evolved. As I work through this, think about what you're seeing and what you're hearing, and ask what kind of similarities you see between each generation of these witches and what that might have to do with the image you just drew. So I'm going to start in Mesopotamia, where the witch is a legacy of myth and legend. They're often in Mesopotamian cultures associated with demons and the evil eye. We have figures there such as Lilith, found in countless Aramaic magical texts, and whose name is often uttered in protective incantations for pregnant women. She's also found in the text called the Alphabet of Ben Sirach, which is a collection of fables from ancient Jewish and Christian cultures. Lilith is the first created female and consort of Adam, but she refuses to lie beneath Adam during sex, asserting that she is equal to him. Adam is definitely not cool with this and insists upon her subordination in his dominance. Lilith then utters the very first spell. She speaks Yahweh's true name, which is a big no-no, but that also immediately gives her the power of flight. After this, she lives apart as a night creature. She's said to be mother of demons, and she becomes associated with the screech owl. There's also the Witch of Endor, who comes from the Hebrew Bible. Now, that text is the same book that gives us the directive that thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. But it also gives us the story of the Witch of Endor, who is indeed a witch, who does indeed get to live, but only after she conjures up the ghost of a dead prophet. So she's also a strong figure in ancient Greece. She's found in countless epics like Circe and the Odyssey, who has the power to transform men into pigs, or Medea, a powerful witch who aids her husband Jason and his Argonauts. She later takes her revenge upon her husband by killing their sons. They are both supposedly priestesses of Hecate, the goddess of witches. So I'm just going to do a quick mental check-in here and ask you, what are some of the similarities you see already among these ancient depictions of witches? For me, I see that they're all very independent. Some of them have men in their lives, but they're not often dependent on them. In fact, most of them kick them out of bed. They all happen to be female. They all deal in magic and craft. They're very powerful. They're sexual, in touch with their sexuality. They know what they want. They're sensual, and they're kind of fearful. They're highly respected. I'm wondering if there's any echoes of that in your drawings. So moving on, I want to make sure I also say that it's important to note that witchcraft has always existed. And even though I'm talking about the witch as kind of a European Western phenomenon here today, witchcraft is practiced all over the world, in all cultures, by all genders. Witches have existed through time and space. You do not have to be Northern European ancestry to be a witch. America itself has a long and fascinating history of brujas and voodoo witches, but that's not my expertise here. My expertise is medieval and early modern era and current expressions of witchcraft. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. So to get to that, I'm going to talk a little bit about medieval European witches. So we have these ancient texts that I just kind of gave you a quick overview of, which provide us with this image of a witch who is powerful, wise, crafty, skilled, but that image starts to shift. Until the 14th century, witches were largely seen in the same way. They were often depicted as females, often thought to be healers, providing services related to health and childbirth. But something happens in the 14th century where they become linked with evil and Satan. And so we have to ask, what accounts for this shift? And kind of, to sum it up really briefly, the answer is the plague. The plague happens. The plague is what happens. Not a great time to live in. I think we can, this is not a realistic depiction of our life right now, but some of us might feel it. Thank you, Hieronymus Bock. But the plague wipes through Europe in the 14th century, killing nearly half of the population. It completely disrupts all authoritarian authority structures. So government, religion, all accepted hierarchies are called into question. And this is largely because this disease goes through the population and no one knows where it's coming from or who caused it. This is obviously not a scientific understanding that we have today. And because of that, fear and suspicion and anger end up kind of being the cultural vibe at the time. Does this sound familiar? I'm thinking this might sound familiar. And because of this, there's a lot of scapegoating. People get blamed for this, mostly Jews, gypsies, and women. Again, I think this is hitting perhaps a little close to home, especially if we brought our governor, Gretchen Whitmer, into this. I think she would see this. In 1482, the Pope commissions a full report on the state of witchcraft in Europe. And the result is this text, the Malleus Maleficarum. It becomes, for about 200 years, the how-to DIY manual for finding, torturing, and executing witches. In fact, many historians call this text one of the most dangerous books in all of world literature, as it's responsible for the death of thousands of people. The text, Malleus Maleficarum, translates as Hammer of Witches. Already sounds pretty badass. And it's the first witch hunting manual. It is characterized by a very specific view of what a witch is, and it's one that differs dramatically from earlier times. It's authored by this German man, Heinrich Kramer, who works for the church, and what he does is he links the practice of witchcraft to heresy, which means that it's punishable by death. As I say, he's got a very specific view of witches. I'm going to go through them really quickly with some great images. One is that witches have a pact with the devil. That means that they reject God and therefore Christ and their own salvation. This pact also usually involves some kind of sexual relations with the devil. The pact also gives them superpowers, like aerial flight. Witches use brooms or other staffs to go flying to the night so they can get to their super fun raver parties called the Witches' Sabbath, which happen in the woods, usually at remote locations and often under the cover of night. These assemblies, which are often presided over by Satan himself, involve a super fun time of incest, promiscuous sex, cannibalism, bestiality, and then, of course, every witch has to show her dedication to Satan by engaging in the osculum infame, or the kiss of shame, in which she is made to kiss the devil's ass. The witches also have familiars associated with them, often in the figures of cats or dogs, or rabbits and other, I would say, very common animals. They help the witch do her bidding and connect her to Satan. And of course, witches engage in maleficent magic. They curse crops and livestock. They cause illnesses. They get blamed for preventing conceptions, for causing miscarriages or stillborns. They make men impotent. If you note, most of their magic, or their black magic, has to do with growth or health or reproduction. And it's interesting because the folk healers that women were did these things, but for good, not for evil. They were, in fact, the village experts on sexuality. I'd like to bring attention to the brooms really quickly, because the whole point of the Malleus Maleficarum is that it focused so much on the sexuality of witches. Remember that story of Adam and Lilith. There's really no room for sexual pleasure in church doctrine, just procreation. So any enjoyment of sexual activity is completely condemned. And Cranmer singles out women as fornicators. They're super horny and therefore most likely to become witches. And he relates stories of how women pervert domestic tools like brooms and spoons to pleasure themselves and to fly through the air. So thanks to Cranmer and his sexual hangups, the witch loses her powerful position as an independent woman, and now she's in total subordination to the devil. In fact, Cranmer and the church really can't comprehend a group of women without a male authority. The very idea of a group of women getting together is, in fact, the most terrifying thing to them. And in short, the witch becomes Satan's puppet. And it's because of that she has to be punished and found out. And so he gives explicit instructions on how to do that. The methods for identifying witches are painful, dehumanizing, and often fatal. Women were stripped and searched for a devil's mark or the witch's teat, which could be any birthmark or mole or even a flea bite. Inspectors used a jabbing needle to see if these marks were insensitive to pain. So if the witch didn't flinch from pain, that meant women didn't flinch from pain, it meant she was a witch. This is a 3-inch long spike. And this image actually comes from the British Museum, where they have several of these. What's most interesting about them is that all of them have this spike, which is retractable into a spring-loaded handle. So the unfortunate woman, in fact, never feels pain, but is always a witch. There's also the swimming test, which you may have heard of, where the suspected woman will be thrown into water. If she floated, she was a witch and guilty, and if she drowned, she was innocent. But either way, she was dead. Often women would be tortured until they confessed or died. In fact, the Malleus makes it clear that deception should be used during torture. In fact, telling witches they would live if they confessed. But even if they confessed, they would be executed, often burnt. And this way, women who are accused of witchcraft are damned if they do and damned if they don't, something I think a lot of women can relate to through time. The Maleficarum was incredibly popular, not only because it's widely disseminated due to the new printing press, but because it offers salacious and scandalous details about devil sex within the guise of this really pious church document. It's filled of terrifying and lurid tales of witches and their victims. It's basically a medieval BDSM erotica, including, I would add, an amazing description of witches stealing penises and keeping them as pets. So it naturally becomes a bestseller, and it becomes the primary guidebook for inquisitors and judges and later writers. In fact, it inspires King James, who writes his own version called the Daemonology, which becomes a Protestant version of a witch hunting book. This is an incredibly influential source to Shakespeare, who we heard at the very beginning of this in his Macbeth. He's inspired by King James' book, as well as Cranmer, and of course, of pagan Greek sense of witches in the form of the Fates. I'm going to move really quickly right now, and the time that I have, I've lost track of time. I hope I'm okay. When I say the history of witches is the history of women, I mean that in a very real sense. For example, women were kept out of courts because they were perceived by law as minors. But with European witch trials, women for the first time were entered into legal history. So in that way, it is very much part of women's history. I also want to make clear that witch hunting is a capitalist enterprise. You've got these figures like Matthew Hopkins here, who's an unsuccessful lawyer, but he's responsible for over 300 executions as a witch hunter. Those executions, he was paid very well for. So there's often a monetary reason for also killing these women, right? So I'm going to just do a quick check-in. So some of the similarities among these medieval depictions of witches: they're evil, they're in league with Satan, they're dangerous, they engage in lots of taboos like killing children, they often work as a collective. And I want to ask if there are any echoes of those in your drawings. Feel free as you continue to listen to me to add some details based on what you've learned so far. So I'm going to move really quickly into American witch hunts. Many of us may be familiar with the Salem trials of the American witch hunts, although Salem was just one of many towns in New England who engaged in witch hunt and witch executions. But we often don't hear about those other towns. In fact, we also don't even learn about European witch hunts, even though there were thousands of people killed. They're not usually included in art history textbooks. I often ask myself why Salem sticks with us despite the low body count. Perhaps it's because of our American bias. Perhaps it's because of Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible. Perhaps because it's so hard for us to think of something so incredibly bonkers occurring here, although I think 2020 is giving a run for its money. But it's been attributed, the Salem witch trials have been attributed to mold on wheat or economic hardship and countless other reasons. But really, the real reason is that an oppressive culture based on fear breeds more fear. And a culture where society, a population of the society is given no power, will do whatever it can to get power, even if it means destroying some of itself. Puritan culture is a fundamental religious group that is based on the Bible as received truth. There's no sense of meriting salvation. You either have it or you don't when you're born. And there's lots of really strict gender roles happening in this culture, such as male authority figures and female subordination to those figures. There's lots of strict rule, like no sex only for procreation. There's no singing. There's no dancing. It's not a fun. I wouldn't want to live there. Let's just put it that way. So what happens in Salem, though, is that around 1691, two prepubescent women start acting strangely, often exhibiting physical symptoms and contortions. But after no physical illness could be ascertained, it's determined that these two young women, who, by the way, live in the house of the respected reverend of the town, are suffering from something supernatural. And the girls are eventually diagnosed as bewitched. Soon these symptoms spread to other women in Salem. And if you think about it, when proper behavior for a Puritan girl included speaking infrequently and with deference to male relatives, these women had power. They were paid attention to, they were listened to, and so when doctors, parents, and religious authorities asked them to reveal the origin of their maladies, they accused several women in their own town. Mainly Tituba, a Black enslaved woman, Sarah Osborne, a wealthy landowner with no heirs, Sarah Good, a beggar woman, and Rebecca Nurse, a pious elderly woman. These were the first women accused, although there were others. I'd like to point out that this Black enslaved woman, the woman with no heirs or children, a beggar, and an elderly woman all exist on the margins of society. They're women, and they're not part of the powerful status quo. And I'm often taken with Tituba's trial record, for when she was asked what the devil looked like, she said, "He's a tall white man who wears a black hat." Essentially every single man in that courtroom, including her enslaver. As I started this talk, I assert that the history of witches is the history of women, and it is a history of persecution and marginalization, of disenfranchisement, of misogyny, of sexual objectification, of damning if you do or if you don't. because by 1693, 200 people were accused of witchcraft, more than 50 confessed, and under 20 had been executed. But it took until 1706 for an apology to be made. Now, while this is the history of witchcraft and witches, I'd also want to point out that while there's a resurgence for this, because for the past century, whenever a witch appeared in stories, she was always dangerous and threatening. But now we see her more as a good witch. Witchcraft is seeing a resurgence, even though she's been a monstress for nearly a millennia. We have to ask ourselves, how did that happen? And this reclamation is part of women's history, namely the women's movement. Starting in the 60s and 70s, goddess circles began to be formed around the US and Europe, which sought to restore and revive the witch as a figure of powerful female independence, a transgressive icon who could subvert the patriarchy. Today, oh, actually, before I even get to that, though, I also want to bring up Margaret Adler is a big part of this movement, and she says she offers a different definition of a witch than that Merriam-Webster definition, as a woman who lives outside of society and outside of society's definitions of women. Today, 21st century witch movement is reflecting a new wave of feminism, one that is inclusive and social justice oriented. As Pam Grossman says, a witch is the shadow cast by every woman you've ever known. We also see witches in pop culture that attempt to reclaim or revise the witch. Everything from Hocus Pocus, in which these witches are evil, but also kind of goofy and lovable. But then we have Thrilling Adventures of Sabrina, or American Horror Story, the Coven series, which show us a far more powerful and independent version of witches. We see witches in our celebrity musicians, of course, Stevie Nicks, but also Tori Amos and Beyonce, who kind of take on the witch as a mantle for themselves. Brie Luna, the founder and operator of Hood Witch, she says that being a witch means the power to boldly and unapologetically embrace nature, heal yourself, and heal your community, to respect the seen and unseen realms. It means the freedom to be your most authentic self, to embrace all aspects of whomever that may be, and fiercely. In this way, the witch is everyone, every artist, every activist, every sports star, rock star, man, woman, trans, and non-binary. More than anything, the witch is a symbol of femme power and a force for ending the toxic status quo. Whether the witch is depicted as villainous or virtuous, she's always a figure of freedom, both its loss and its gain. She is perhaps the only female archetype who is independent, and that she is not defined by her relationship to a man. The witch owes nothing, and that's what makes her dangerous and divine. So the witch ends up being this ultimate feminist icon because she's a fully rounded symbol of both oppression and liberation. And I ask you to return to your image. Don't change your witch, but add to it. Perhaps she has friends. Perhaps change her gender. Perhaps make her more real and realistic. Perhaps you can make her you. I'd be happy to talk to anyone about these topics. You can find me on Instagram, and coming soon is my new podcast, Witches and Bitches, which explores all of this in far more detail. Thanks so much.
That was awesome. Now, Dr. Imbrasio,
Tried to go through that so fast, so I hope that worked for everyone.
Are you open to some questions, or?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I just didn't know if we'd have time for questions, but I'm absolutely happy to have.
Awesome.
Yes.
What we can do is we'll do the hand raising thing again. So if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand. I've also got all of you on screen, so if you just raise your hand in front of your camera, I can grab you too. So let's go ahead and get started with any questions you've got or comments. Nothing so far? Okay.
That was a lot there that you're digesting. I hope it all made sense. I usually teach for like an hour and a half, so. Yep.
Yeah, I was actually raised in more like a Wiccan kind of growing family growing up. My mom, who's actually on here, is also, I believe, somewhat Wiccan. I don't know. She's on mute, but so that was kind of interesting. Yeah, it was like you always got questions in school and stuff like, oh, so like you guys are like evil or something. It's like,
Yeah,
no,
no.
no.
But also, Wiccans are not necessarily witches, and witches are not necessarily Wiccans. So Wiccan's a religion, and witchcraft is more of a practice, right? So, but witches can be Wiccans, and Wiccans can be witches, but they're not always the same. Like the
Especially
Venn
with
diagram there is a little tricky.
Right. Yeah. Especially with those later definitions that you were.
Yeah.
So Wiccan and witches, do they embrace like we always think of them as casting spells or being magical?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the case? I mean, is there still a practice of
Oh, absolutely.
casting spells?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you quite well, but there absolutely is a practice in terms of, I think Wiccans usually engage in ritual that involves nature and the elements of nature. They also often pray to deities, where witches may or may not do those things. So witches do engage in rituals, often spell casting, but they may not necessarily have deities that they honor. So that's one big difference.
Deities typically Satan?
No. Deities usually often are pagan deities of old. So, yep. So, and some Wiccans just kind of say, Gaia, the goddess of the earth, or they may be very specific and say they find a personal connection to, say, Athena or the god, Mercury or something like that. Whereas witches, there can be satanic witches. It's a whole other category of witchcraft. But most witches don't actually have any involvement whatsoever with Satan. That's just bad PR.
What's the marital status of the majority of witches?
The what?
The marital status.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I haven't run a survey, so, but I don't know. But I would say that everything in between. The one thing that's really fascinating to me right now is looking at the resurgence of witches for millennials and younger, right? Because those tend to be women and trans women and non-binary folks and men, where witchcraft is far more inclusive. And those folks may be in relationships or not, but the idea of witchcraft being something that's also like a social movement is very prevalent for that generation of folks who are getting involved.
Yeah, I've heard one critique of Wiccanism is that it still focuses pretty heavily on gender roles.
Yes, and it being very binary, right? It's the god and the goddess, right? But except for certain figures like the figure of Mercury or the figure of Loki and Norse myth, those are actually what I would call relatively queer gods, in that they often transcend. Loki's constantly changing his form, so it's sometimes is a female and sometimes a male, and sometimes has children as a female and sometimes has children as a male. So there's also an ancient myth, a lot of opportunities to see different realities that are relatable to folks who also do not engage in the binary.
Yeah, I'd heard that a lot of the things that we depict as like witch was something that there were stereotypes of Jewish people too.
Mm-hmm.
So
the hooked nose. Yep, that's a big one. Yeah, and that all comes from like that the plague scapegoating that kind of happens, because Jews, gypsies, and witches are the main. And to say witches, to ask, a lot of students ask me, but were the women in Salem, or were the women killed in the European witch trials, were they actually witches? And, you can't ever really know. Most likely not. Most likely, most of those women who were accused of witchcraft weren't witches. Some of them may have been. But I think you then have to ask yourself, well, what is a witch? Is a witch a person who, likes to follow the cycles of the moon and tries to heal with herbs? Is that a witch? Perhaps, for then that would have been a witch. Whereas now we just see that as like, a person who likes homeopathy, like it's a different thing entirely. So, and that's why I think now the category of witch is such a much more inclusive. I have a good friend who considers herself a witch, who's actually an ordained Buddhist. but her religion is Buddhism, but her personal like strength, how she identifies in terms of independent woman who tries to, you know, be engaged in social justice activities, comes from a identity as a witch. So witch is kind of fluid, and that's what's so exciting about it.
That's really cool.
Yeah. I'm happy to answer any other questions, but I also want to say that I want to make clear that we talk about women and witches a lot, but I also want to be really clear that women were not the only people accused of witchcraft. Men were as well, but 80% of those who actually were executed were women. And I think that is something that's often overlooked. I'm sorry, though, someone was going to ask a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that actually, because there were some men who were executed in the Salem witch trials, right?
One.
Okay, just the one?
One, Matthew Corey. And Matthew Corey is one of my favorites because he's the man who is pressed to death by stones. And when it seems like he's going to confess right before he dies, the judges lean towards him and they say, oh, he's trying to say something. And they get down there and he utters out with his last breath, more weight. So he's kind of an ultimate badass. But Matthew Corey most likely was not a practicing witch. What he was an incredibly wealthy man. And a lot of the Salem witch trials involved people who had land that other people wanted. So Matthew Corey, if he died as a witch, his lands would become public, meaning that they would not go to his heirs. So people could bid on it and have his incredibly, his rich fields. So a lot of witch trials also involve, trying to take people who had some kind of power. And Matthew Corey was also famous or infamous in the Salem village as not going to church. He's kind of a crotchety man who lived on the outskirts. Those end up being those folks end up being the targets as well. But yes, men were accused, but often not executed for witchcraft. And most often their accusations of witchcraft were because they were associated with a woman who was accused as a witch.
No, he was a pious man?
No. No, Matthew Corey he was a town elder, but he was, a lot of folks were like, well, you weren't it was Puritan time. So going to being at church meeting every weekend, every Sunday was very important. And he would not always be there. In fact, that was one of the issues of evidence against him. And then when asked to say the Lord's Prayer, he could not, which is also considered evidence that, you're a witch if you can't utter the Lord's Prayer. Also, if you speak Latin.
So it was more like not fitting into the perceived status quo of the community.
Pretty much.
And because the men were ensnared by these witches, and therefore, you're forgiven. You didn't know what you were doing.
Yep. In fact, one of the Sarah Good, who is one of the early accused witches, her husband, who was with their accusing her was one of the accusers, ends up when the town of Salem realizes they've done something horrible and they decide to offer some kind of sad sack retribution. He gets paid. He gets the 30 pounds for having his wife executed. And he was the one who actually stood in court and accused her. So, this ended up being a way for people with power to assert their dominance, and it ended up being a way to kind of publicly shame those who did not share in that power, such as Tituba, the Black enslaved woman, or beggar women. The town midwife was accused as being a witch. Yes, midwives end up being, unfortunately, a large population of those who are accused and executed for witchcraft.
You need those midwives.
You do. But at the time, midwives do more than just birth babies. They also help people not have babies. And so for a big portion of the population, that's just as bad as stealing babies and eating them. So midwives also were you know, they did more than just birth babies or help people not have babies. They also helped young children be well, healthy and well. They helped mothers nurse. They helped also with, interestingly enough, lots of times midwives are brought in to help birth livestock, thinking that if they can birth humans, they can birth a cow. So they end up being kind of life givers to the community, but they also know a lot about when you don't want to procreate. So they end up, there's an alignment there with the board of services that the midwives produce with their accusations of witchcraft.
You just can't win. You're trying.
You just, yeah, damned if you do and damned if you don't, as they say.
A couple of years ago, I went to Iceland, and I stumbled upon, they have like a witchcraft museum there.
Yes,
like
I have been there.
Okay, yeah. It's like a tiny little,
yeah, it's in the middle of nowhere, and they get really excited when you show up.
Yeah.
Did you get your bones? Did you get your runes read or your bones read?
Oh no, we got
okay,
some really good food, but
okay, okay.
But it was interesting to hear that it was mainly men that were the witches there or whatever.
Yeah, and different cultures, there's different traditions. And in Iceland, it's lots of men. There are women as well. In fact, women are seen, though, in that culture as more of sages and seers. They have the ability for premonition. And so they're often seen, like I said, you get your bones thrown or your runes read. But men actually deal, like magician. The magician is quite popular there, right? Yeah. Interestingly enough, in King James's demonology, he was okay with magicians. He just wasn't okay with witches. Magicians were considered to be intelligent readers of the sky, dealing with astrology and these kind of scientific principles of geomancy, you know. But witches were definitely a danger.
Again, along the gender lines there.
Yes. Right? But also in terms of education, right? You had to be educated, you had to be literate to be a magician because you had to read the sky, you had to know, the alchemists, right? Changing, gross substances into gold, that was okay. But, birthing a baby or, helping a lame cow, then you've got your 2 steps to the pyre. So.
Very cool.
Yeah. Other questions or comments or experiences that folks want to share?
So the resurgence of course, it was thought as a negative thing now, and you're saying it's coming into its own again.
Very much.
Like a rejection of organized religion. And but still, it seems like when you enter then this area, you still want magic to be part of the belief system.
Mm-hmm.
You just don't believe in the organized religion part of it. So
right. I think it's also, I've heard once someone said to a very young witch said to me, my friends make fun of me because I have, crystals and I light incense and I read tarot cards. But when has astrology or tarot cards ever been the source of persecution for other people in terms of like that doesn't tell you to persecute others, right? So for folks who feel like they're not part of the power structure, who are in fact disenfranchised by the power structure, women, LGBTQ, folks with disabilities, folks who just feel like they're not given access to power, they tend to turn to those methods, those tools, those techniques, and those traditions that also were outliers to that power structure. And they see that power structure as something that's oppressive to them or their friends or their loved ones. So why would they want to engage in, and in fact, many witches come out of a really strong Christian tradition, and then they kind of, push it aside to embrace a different kind of tradition. So the idea of, no tarot card ever told someone to commit genocide. So that's kind of the aspect there. But also, I wouldn't say, what I find so interesting about it is that the resurgence of witchcraft takes on a whole new life in the 21st century with social media. So in the 60s and 70s, it often involved these women doing goddess circles in their living rooms or in their backyards. And now we have young women who are connecting on websites, who are connecting on Instagram, who are connecting on social media. In fact, there's a movement in Baltimore of Black witches who have a tradition of voodoo, who are connecting with other Black witches that they would not have been able to 10, 20 years ago. So there are all these like new movements that are still communal, even though people are far apart, or even though someone might be living in a Christian home and feel like they can't necessarily lay out their tarot cards, they still can connect with other people through social media. So I think a big part of the resurgence is not so much a rejection of organized religion, but more so a rejection of what that organized religion has dictated for, you know, millennia in terms of rules or how it sees women or the rejection of LGBTQ folks, and embracing a more inclusive and honestly more like you have a direct line to power when you do magic. There's no intermediary. So I think that's what's really compelling for these folks.
So it's kind of like choosing which magical tradition is the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems that there is, I believe in the universe, an objective reality. And just like the 30,000 denominations of Christianity, you pick the one that you like.
Mm-hmm.
How does that relate to an objective reality?
Well, I would say that those who are witches don't subscribe to an objective reality. You believe in magic and in an enchanting of the world, and that you have a power to influence the world and the natural elements in some way. Witches believe that the actions that they take on this plane has an impact in another plane. Witches believe that doing a spell or an incantation or looking at cards can allow to divination, can help them take control over their actual reality. So I would say, while it's not an organized religion, it does necessarily have that religious mystical component of engaging in ritual, engaging in performance, engaging in incantations, songs, the idea that what I do here in small has larger ramifications beyond. And if you don't believe in magic or enchantment of the world, then it's not for you. In the same way that if you don't believe, for example, for Catholics, that in transubstantiation, that the host becomes the body of Christ, you might not want to go to a Catholic mass. So what I would say early on, many faiths do engage in that kind of enchantment.
Well, if it gets results or offers comfort or...
Yeah. In fact, if you talk to witches right now, you can thank all of them for 2020. Because witches have been hexing Donald Trump since 2017. And this year, 2020, is the year of the emperor, and they have all along said that this is the year in which stuff is going to come down, that the status quo of patriarchy and capitalism, that all things will be revealed in terms of racist idea. Again, if you are in that community, they will say, you know, we all did a huge hexing of Donald Trump, and look what's happened. In fact, October 1st, first week of October was the full moon. And there was a large movement of witches on social media to do some work. And then, you know, a few days later, Donald Trump comes down with coronavirus. So if you talk to them, they would say that they're partially responsible for this. I'm not sure about that, but I will say that I do believe that we all could use with a little re-enchantment of the world, of seeing our earth as a place of wonder, of something that we need to work with and work for instead of working against and using it as a resource. And I think that witches do help us see the earth and our environment as something that is living and beautiful and needing to work in collaboration with instead of an adversary to.
Very cool. Did Alex and Jessica have something to say? I saw you were unmuted for just a little bit, but...
Yeah, so kind of going back to what you were saying before about how in that one culture, uh, magicians and witchcraft was kind of reserved for those who are kind of more studied and stuff like that. Is there kind of more of a prevalence elsewhere for this conflation of witchcraft with like a high intelligence or the pursuit of science, especially when that science went against like, you know, religious teachings and stuff like that, especially with respect to like medicine and, you know, other areas like that?
Well, I think I can say now that even there are many folks. In fact, I have a very good friend who is a magician, and I mean the kind of stuff he does. I'm like, it's just a lot of math, and like literally lots and lots of math, and all these crazy maps and things. It's called geomancy, and there's a bunch of other things that are involved, but it's really high brain stuff. And I would say the difference between a magician and engaging in that like high intellect, that, or what's often called hermetic, right? This kind of, it's almost just as ritual as any organized religion. Whereas those who practice witchcraft, it's like, well, I got this rosemary in my kitchen and we're going to do something with it. Or, you know, I'm going to light a candle and say some words, or I'm here right now and we're going to do this. It's not as, it's far more embodied, I'd say neck down, as opposed to magic and magicians who, you know, high magic, which is all like shoulders and up, it's all head. You know, they're trying to like summon lesser demons and shit like that. But I would say that in terms of the strife between organized religion and that, there wasn't much. In fact, John Dee in early modern England, so this is in Renaissance England, John Dee is a magician. He's Queen Elizabeth's astrologer, and he's considered one of the most important people to Queen Elizabeth and to the court. He's in fact credited with the storm that prevents the Spanish Armada from coming to England's shores. So here we have a woman, Queen Elizabeth, who is a member of her own created Protestant church, or created by her dad, Protestant church, and yet employs a magician. And magicians today who work in that tradition, like John Dee is one of their great granddaddies, right? Like he's one of their like great magicians of history. So we see a lot of times, at least in other culture in history, where we see the powers that be actually engaging these magicians. And I actually would say the story of the Witch of Endor from the Bible is that story where King Saul needs a witch stat. Unfortunately, he's gone and killed them all. So he goes to find one and asks her to do his bidding. So we see a lot of instances in history and in legend and in literature of the powers that be using witches when it's convenient for them and then killing them when it's not. I'm not sure if that quite answers your question.
It does a little bit.
Okay.
It does sound like there's kind of this category I don't know if you'd call it witchcraft, but certainly magic and magicians who are employing this kind of like theoretical aspect to their practice. Is it fair to say that that's like a separate category from more of like an applications based like
so I'm typing in the chat right here. Most witches say they practice magic. Most magicians say they practice magic with a K. Magic with a K means like this whole other level. Like it's this, again, this kind of, whereas magic is like, you know, it's how I see the world. It's who I connect with. I go for a walk in nature. I try to, you know, it's very embodied in the moment. Whereas you have this other far more what I would call like hierarchical, and, you know, hierarchical expression of seeing the world as enchanted. And I would agree with you, and I validate what you're saying in terms of like, it's just completely, they're just completely different practices. It doesn't mean those two people don't hang out. Like I said, I have a very good friend. It just means that we have completely different approaches to how we see the world. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I wanted to comment. John's mentioned in the comments that he's a naturalistic pagan.
Okay.
And he mentioned in the comment here, so I wanted to read it out. He said, definitely some re-enchantment needed. I've seen many rituals with other pagans, and for me, those rituals are a powerful way to access parts of our brain, which brings meaning and fullness to life. No supernatural needed.
Right. I will say that's fantastic. Thank you for calling my attention to that in the chat. And John, I completely hear you, see you, validate that. And I often say that for someone who is thinking, I get lots of students of mine who like, they go through my class and then they're like, okay, now I want to be a witch. What do I do? And, you know, what crystal should I get? What tarot decks? And I say, none of that. You don't need any of it. You are the instrument. You are the power. So that's another, I think, a reason that witchcraft sees such a resurgence is that the power is in the person. It is an individual experience, as opposed to I have to go seek power from something else, right? Someone else has the power and I need to get access to it or be able to get at it. The idea with witchcraft is that you are it. You don't need anything other than your body and your voice and your mind.
You know, in biblical teaching, when Jesus would heal someone, he would often say, "Your faith healed you."
Mm-hmm.
He wouldn't say, he said, "You did it to yourself," kind of. So
yeah. And I will say this about witches, though, just about that, about like healing and stuff. You'll never meet a group of more scientific mind, you know, like, oh yeah, they're working towards your personal healing, not your like, go get the vaccine, go get a flu shot, take the medicine, right? There's no sense of, well, I'll just, you know, say a few words and I won't have this cold or something like that. You know, I don't want to make it seem that witches are healers, but of a different kind. And I would say that there are witches, though, who do engage in actual like herbal crafts, herbalism, are trained midwives, are trained doulas. Like, these women have actual training and they're also witches, but that doesn't necessarily mean that witches are scientists or doctors. But yes, it's often your own self-conception that can give you empowerment to change your world.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I've been reading a book by Murray Bookchin called it's about like social ecology, and you talked about how a lot of people see it like as a adversarial thing with nature, and that we need to be moving more towards like working with nature.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about how kind of early societies had more of a, we're on the same par with nature than
Mm-hmm.
Against, you know, adversarial against it or something.
I will say that there's a fascinating book by a woman named Sylvia Ferraris, who is she's actually a economist and a Marxist economist, and she does a lot of history of she's one of the great historians of women in witchcraft, but links most of the accusations of witches really against like the same enclosure of the land, a sense of owning land. Most of these women, you know, as I say, existed on the margins of society, that were accused of witchcraft in the medieval and early modern era. And it's really through the rise of capitalism that they cannot function in this new world, and this new economy. But she also links that to environmental degradation itself, and that when we look at, you know, enclosure of land and, you know, rise of domestic animals in terms of, you know, even like, you know, industry farms and things like that, that we lose our sense of enchantment and connection with the earth and with nature. And that is something we need to reclaim in terms of re-enchanting, of seeing the earth as like a living thing that we have a relationship with, as opposed to a resource that we can commodify and, you know, use at will.
What was your name again?
I actually have the text. Her name is Sylvia. One of them is it's not, that's another text, The Uses of Enchantment. That's Bruno Bettelheim. Sorry. And I'm going to put her name in the chat for you. I just want to make sure I spell it right. Because otherwise I will Sylvia Federici. Here we go.
So it sounds like you were kind of familiar with Murray Bookchin.
No, but I'm familiar with that argument.
Okay.
There you go. Sylvia Federici. She's got a bunch of books. Caliban and the Witch. The uses of it, re-enchanting the world, things like that. So she's fantastic. She's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's an added sense of urgency for that too. I was reading there's a article in Cells that Dr. Fauci published with another doctor, and they had emphasized that we're living in an age of pandemics. This is kind of just the first big one of many to come, and if we don't return to living in more harmony with nature, the lack of trees and our constant our growth of our cities is just going to create more and more pandemics. So
yes,
kind of scary thought, but
right. And a lot of folks point to the relationship we have with animals as that as well, right? Like the kind of industrialization of raising animals for food has contributed to not only climate change, but also contributes to pandemics. You know, most of these epidemics that we've seen in the past 20 years originate from whether it be swine or bats, you know, other food industries. So being mindful of that as well. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right.
One
If
more,
we, yeah, go ahead.
Kind of question or comment. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this kind of resurgence in witchcraft in the modern day and stuff like that, and this appeal of the modern witchy aesthetic.
I have a lot to say about that. I have a lot to say about that. Please, yes, I love this question.
Yeah, because I feel like there are so many people drawn to like just the witchy aesthetic, and I kind of want to know, like, you know, is that more just kind of like not an unawareness of, you know, the fact that, you know, anyone can be a witch without the crystals and the candles and like the tools, or like, is there this like popularization of witchy tools and stuff like that?
I'm just going to say it's consumerism and capitalism is essentially what it is, right? It's like, oh, this is cool and some young kids like it. So now, you know, urban, you know, decay, you know, we're going to sell this now at, you know, I don't know, in the mall or something, you know, you can find it somewhere. And I really encourage folks, and I say this often to my students, to think about, you know, if you're going to be consuming such products like crystals and t-shirts, like think about where they're coming from. Think about who's making them. If you truly want to be a witch or live that kind of life, then you need to be aware of, you know, child labor in other countries and how buying that item of clothing is contributing to that, just so you can have a t-shirt that says witchy vibes, you know. If you're buying crystals, are they sourced in an environmental sustainable way, or are you just buying them from the Forever 21 shop or whatever that's closed now? But what you're saying, like, were you just, you know, getting them because they're cute and pretty or whatever? But I do feel like there is this, just because of the world we're in right now, in that you know, anything that's remotely trending for 2 seconds gets a t-shirt, a mug, and a, you know, bumper sticker. So I think there's something to be said of that. On the other hand, I also think it's amazing that there is such a resurgence and people are interested in this. And that's why I think websites like the Hood Witch are amazing, because that's a website of resources, but also products. But all those products are vetted and sustainably sourced. And with these newer young witches like Brie Luna, who is the founder of Hood Witch, she has come out and said, listen, all you people burning sage, do you know where it comes from? Do you know who, when you buy it, who it's benefiting? Is it actually going back to native populations and helping them grow more sage? Or are you just buying it from some corporation that sells it through Whole Foods, right? Like, so being aware, and also, what are you doing when you burn sage? Are you just doing it because it's what you hear you're supposed to be doing? Are you giving honor and respect to the tradition in which you are kind of in that moment co-opting? So being really hyper aware of cultural appropriation, of where products come from, and of being mindful consumers of this, I think is a strong message from some of the witches today, who are quite popular and real presence on social media. But there is something to be said of this kind of consumerism aesthetic that is happening. But I would say throughout time, witches and witchcraft have been, it follows the women's movement. And you know, it happens in the 60s and 70s. There's another kind of vibe in the 90s with things like the Lilith Fair and stuff like that. And then we have it again now in the 21st century. And I'm sure it will die down in a bit, and then we'll have another wave. But despite those peaks and those valleys, it's important to realize that witches and witchcraft have existed throughout millennia, throughout time, throughout cultures, for all genders. And I feel like that's the kind of stuff that I really want to hold on to. And I just sort of try to encourage folks to be mindful about how they are co-opting or participating in various traditions.
So it's an ancient tradition that is older than Christianity or Buddhism, or I mean, you're saying it's been going on forever.
Oh yeah, in the same way that, I mean, it's just as old as humans are. I mean, the very idea of, you know, saying a word, knowing the concept of knowing the true name of a thing, and therefore giving you power over it, which is in essence the basis of a spell, has existed since human beings could utter words. The idea that you could call something what it is and have a kind of power or control over it, has existed in every culture. And I will also like to point out that there are countless Christian witches or Jewish witches who still follow an organized religious path, but also still engage in these kind of magical workings or divination. I find that fascinating. Because there's lots of parts of Christianity who would be like, you're not supposed to divine, you're not supposed to know the future, that's God's mind, right? But there are many, many, many cultures that engage both and, not an either or.
I can only jump off that, like the power of knowing the name of something. I wonder if you can draw parallels or kind of consider the same thing like this in the discovery of like modern day science and stuff like that, being able to call certain natural processes like what they are by understanding those processes. You then have power and domain over the way that that science is done, to the point where now we can communicate with each other across airwaves, screens and stuff like that, because we understand and can name, you know, the processes that make that possible.
I would say though, the difference is in terms of a witch mentality of that, it's not about having power and domain over, it's about having a collaborative relationship with. And there's actually in Montreal a lab that is a bio, what's the word I'm looking for? Like they make, it's a biology lab. The name will come to me in a minute. That is run by all women and women identifying people, because there's some trans women in this lab as well, who have decided that their lab processes are going to be female focused. And so they are engaging in a completely different methodology and process for science that just is about shifting the language in terms of like, I own this, or I have dominion over this, or I control, or the concept of the control group. They're just using different words for that to have a much more egalitarian and less top-down structure. And I will say this, their job of what they're doing is to make dyes for clothing that are sustainable, because if you may not know, the fashion industry is one of the largest contributors to environmental degradation in terms of dyes and fabrics, right? Fabrics that just never decompose, dyes that poison waterways. And so they're trying to make sustainable, natural dyes that also are scalable for the fashion industry. And this one particular lab, there's a kind of natural dye that a natural color that occurs in nature. It's known as Jesus's blood, because it often appears on statues, those statues of like the crying Marys or the bleeding Christs. It's an actual fungus that makes it appear that that statue is bleeding or crying blood, right? So they want to know, how can we get that? How can we get that fungus to grow in a lab and scale it up? But what you need is a source that has a high iron content, and most of those statues do have a high iron content. So they're thinking, and in order to get this done in labs, they have to get sheep's blood. Sheep's blood is really expensive. It's not sustainable. So these women in this lab decided to use their own menstrual blood. And so it is like the most amazing thing ever, in fact, that they are sourcing their own menstrual blood to do these experiments. It's amazing for them because now they see their menstrual blood as a resource, as opposed to something like, ugh, you know, I'm menstruating, you know, it's a curse, whatever. Also, there are trans members of this lab group who are in relationship with these women and their menstrual blood and have a different role for it, a different role in the lab process that has given them a sense of creativity, and that they're creating this lab, and they're creating this scientific environment in a way that is a creative force that is part of what everyone's doing. So it's a fact. I just listened to the interview with these women recently, and it is amazing. And honestly, it gave me chills just to think of a completely different way to approach science that is, again, about this sort of re-enchantment with the world, but it's still science. Like, it's still like, it's experiments and theories and hypotheses and studies and tests and written up in reports and all that. So I will say, though, getting the clearance from their IRB to use their own menstrual blood is insane. So very interesting. And the that particular story you can find on the podcast called I can't remember the name of the podcast, but the title of it is Witches in Labs. And I think it's called, the podcast is called Hidden Witches.
So
Yeah.
no, if you guys want to save the chat.
Oh, sorry, I just sent that to Austin Edwards instead of everyone. I'm sorry. So Witches in Labs, Hidden Witches, I believe is the name of the actual podcast, but Witches in Labs. It's
and if you want to save this chat, because it's probably not going to once you drop out, there's 3 little buttons in the bottom right of the chat. You click that, and you can click Save Chat. So it'll save all the text here, so you can keep all these notes that Dr. Ambrosio is putting in there. I'll have them. I can try to send them out if I remember, but just to be safe, you guys can grab them there too. So.
Yeah, honestly, that's probably like the coolest thing that I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Kind of putting like this huge ethical focus back into science, which is so neat.
Yeah, there's the link to the podcast, and that particular page for the podcast also has images of these folks working in the labs. Again, it's missing witches, witches in labs, and Speculative Life Biolab in Montreal. And you can actually go to their lab. The woman who runs the lab is a woman, White Feather, who is an indigenous witch. So it's pretty fantastic. So it gave me chills. I also use that podcast in my class a lot with students to kind of get in the science kids. So great.
Okay, I think we're gonna start wrapping up here.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for your great questions and your engagement. I really enjoyed this talk with all of you. As I said on my final slide, feel free to connect with me on Instagram, and there's my handle for Instagram. And pretty soon I'll be having a podcast coming out on these very topics called Witches and Bitches. So I hope I will be announcing that on Instagram. I'm hoping to get the first episode out this month.
Very cool. Thank you. Yeah, we'll have a couple announcements before we head out. Then we had an idea of kind of a way to wrap up the session here, but I think that actually we've already had quite a lot of talking between us, so we might just kind of end it. We'll see. So the first thing, of course, we would appreciate if you guys donated. So if you go to sundaysundaydetroit.org and you click the donate button, it will take you to the PayPal. And here you can either do a one-time donation, or if you would like, to not have to think about it every month. You can make this a monthly donation, and you can choose one of our preset options, or you can do other amount. You can also go to smile.amazon.com, and you can find supporting your preferred organization. Ironic that it's 666. But anyways, this helps kind of trickle a little bit of money in while you're buying stuff. I'm not a huge supporter of Amazon, but if you're going to use it, then smile.amazon is kind of the cool way to do it. Some of the last ones is that there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. Of course, here's today, we've got the assembly, but tomorrow, if you want to help plan these assemblies, you can meet up with us online. We'll be doing the assembly committee, which is led by Anthony. Thursday, we're doing the Wine with Ted. I'm calling it Wine with Ted this month because we're actually going to be doing TED Talks, and I really do want you guys to just drink and have some fun. So we've got some interesting kind of spooky TED Talks picked out. I hope that you guys appreciate. This Friday, we've got the knowledge sharing session. So CJ is going to be giving a history of tarot cards. So talking about some of the ways to practice Wiccanism, but also being a witch potentially. She can tell you a little bit about that. Then our monthly event for volunteering is the Vote Forward letter writing. So that's what I was kind of telling you about in the beginning. We're going to be writing letters to people to get them to go vote. Of course, we've got our leadership meeting. So if you want to get more involved in the whole organization, then that's something to come to. We've got always good stuff going on there. Lots of lively discussions. Next Friday, Anthony has put together a scavenger hunt. So this is something it sounds like we can do in our cars. It's going to be kind of in the Ferndale area, although I don't know, maybe we can walk around a little bit. So he's using, oh, Anthony, what's it called that you're using for that? If you're still on?
I don't know, I'm still here. The app, I still haven't decided whether we're going to do an app or just hand out people printouts.
Okay. Cool. Either way, it should be really good fun. And then our last couple events here at the end of the month, our book club. We're going to be reading some creepypastas, just kind of taking a little lighter load. We were reading some pretty heavy stuff last time and the time before. Well, the time before we did fairy tales, which is pretty sweet. But so this should be good, and we're going to talk about maybe some real life hauntings of houses and things like that. So then just after that, our new member Steve, as I was telling you, is the fitness trivia. So he's going to be doing that on Monday night. And on Halloween, we're doing the LGBT small group is doing a full moon Halloween hike. So I don't know. I think Alex and Jessica can talk to that a little more, speak to that a little more. But it sounds like it's quite a lot of fun.
Yeah, we're going to be going to State Park. I forget which one, Bulb something. And we're going to be going at 8 p.m. It's supposed to be a full moon, so we're just going to enjoy the creepy ambiance while we walk around.
Very cool. And that was pretty much it. We were thinking about kind of ending it with like a life kind of upcoming, kind of like life happens, but life upcoming, just kind of get a sense of closure. But I think we're kind of stretching our time here a little bit. So if it's okay with you guys, I think we'll just end it here, and we'll see you out at the next event.